gratitude to Bridget and for the idea of this training and handling a lot of the logistics. So thank you, Bridget. Just a couple things about Youth for Tomorrow, in case you don't know anything about us. Started as a group home for boys by former Washington Commanders coach Joe Gibbs back in 1986, grew from residential to now we do outpatient services as well in 6 different regional offices around Northern Virginia, excuse me. And we provide also therapeutic day treatment in 3 public school systems in the area. And a lot of what has started has just been a need that we have seen in the community. And so we greatly value all the different organizations who work towards providing the mental and behavioral health services. And whenever we see a need, we want to help fill those. So that's
You're muted, Juliana. You're muted.
Thank you. But yes, we just want to help meet needs in the community. And so we're happy to be able to help provide this training. And also a big thank you to Bernice Felder for being our trainer this afternoon. So before I introduce Bernice, just a couple specifics about getting the CE credits. If you are wanting the CE credits for this training, it's a requirement to keep your camera on. It's just a way that we verify that you are participating. If you don't want CE credit, that's fine. That's up to you on whether you want your camera on or off, but we will be monitoring whether your camera's on. That's an NBCC requirement for our training. Also, in order to get your CE certificate, at the end of the training this afternoon, I'll send you an email with a link to a survey. And once you complete your survey, I will email you your certificate. So that's how that process will go. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. And with that being said, let me introduce Bernice. Or Bridget, do you have anything else you want to say before I turn it over to Bernice? Oh, muted.
Muted.
Okay.
I just want to say there's a handout package in the chat, so you can download that and follow along.
Perfect. So I'll just do a quick introduction for Bernice, and then Bernice will hand it over to you. But Bernice has her master's in human services counseling, crisis response, and trauma from Liberty University. She's the owner of BLF Services, which contracts with multiple counties with Department of Social Services and some public school systems, Fauquier County Department of Juvenile Justice, nurturing parenting program facilitator, volunteer lay counselor at SCSM. She's a mother of 7 and is coming up on 33 years of marriage. So Bernice has a lot of expertise, and we're really looking forward to the training. So thank you so much, Bernice.
Good morning. I'm about to share my screen with you all so that we can do this slide, if I can get it to work. Let's see. I am having a few problems, but let's see, let me get this down. Okay, I think I got it. Okay, can everybody see the PowerPoint? Okay, great. So what we're going to be talking today, and the title of this is Good Grief. And you can take that any way it comes at you. This is a webinar for mental health professionals. However, I also know that there are people on here who are not into mental health. So I'm going to be interchanging using, let's see if I can get a start slideshow from the beginning. All right, here we go. So I'm going to be interchanging between terms for clinicians and the fact of that we have people here who are suffering grief. Honestly, we're all dealing with grief one way or another. So our objectives today, we have 4 objectives. Number 1 is identifying grief. We're going to define grief. We're going to define types of grief, including normal, anticipatory, disenfranchised, and complicated grief. Our second goal is to identify losses, types of losses. We're going to look at grief manifestations, including physical, social, spiritual, and emotional and psychological. And we're going to talk about effective interventions for grief, with attention to cultural insights, gender considerations. And because many of you work with young people, we're going to spend a little time on what grief looks like in our younger population. So there are some things I want to point out. I have on here, if you look under Be Advised, grief brings with it sadness, anger, fear, and many powerful emotions. You may find that the discussions can cause feelings like that to surface. If you begin to feel overwhelmed or uncomfortable, please feel free to mute or leave the webinar. I know that you have to keep your camera on, so keep that in mind if you're trying to get the credits. But this is a difficult subject for a lot of people. So I just wanted to put that out there, because we will be given, I will be giving you guys proven effective coping mechanisms to deal with these issues. And also, as a disclaimer, this is not intended to be a substitute for professional counseling. If you feel you need help, please reach out, and we can put you in touch with appropriate sources. All right, so we're going to be using the terms of grief and loss interchangeably. The slides will interchange, like I said, with personal pronouns and clinical terms. If you have any questions, please note the slide number, and we will address those in the time period for questions. And there is a participants package that I want you to take note that in the references and the additional resources, there are underlined parts of them. Those are great resources. Many of them include assessments if you're going to be assessing for grief, but because of copyright restrictions, I couldn't include them in the package. So first, let's look at identifying grief. So grief is the experience of one who has lost a loved one to death. It is comprised of thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and physiological changes that vary in pattern and intensity over time. It is intense emotional suffering, a sense of acute sorrow and deep sadness. It is derived from the Latin verb meaning to burden. So grief is natural. It is a unique response, individual to the person. It is a terrible emotional pain, and it has its own life and process. It's not linear. It comes and goes. It's all over the place. Grief can be outrageously painful. It is the feeling of loss at an interrupted or broken connection. It usually begins with the unexpected and is the emotional expression of a newly created space or ended connection. Grief is what you feel when there's a loss. Now we're going to look at mourning, because mourning is what you do when there's a loss. Mourning has been defined by Wolfett as a shared social response to loss. It implies activity, an explicit need to do or experience one's grief. Mourning is applied to the process that one goes through in adapting to the death of a person. Warden, who I relied on extensively, he has identified 4 tasks of mourning. The first task is to accept the reality of the loss, and we're going to talk a little bit about each of these, so I'm going to go to the next slide. The first is to accept the reality of the loss. When a loss occurs, many will use denial tactics, which can be practiced on many different levels and can take various forms, but it often involves either the facts of the loss, the meaning of the loss, or the irreversibility of the loss. Because acceptance involves intellect and emotions, this task will take time. Traditional rituals can support the accomplishment of this task. For instance, funerals, wakes, cultural activities, faith practices. They can help with accepting the loss. The second task is to process the pain of the grief. Grief is not one emotion, and no one emotion is appropriate for the grieving. People react to loss in different ways, at different times, and in different situations. But usually the first response to grief is that of pain. So there's often a silent conspiracy with others that support delaying this task. Very few people feel comfortable with their own grief. They feel very uncomfortable with the sadness of others who are grieving. So they give subtle messages or platitudes, okay, you're going to be fine, or you can have another baby, or another man will come along. So this kind of helps bind the griever in a place where they cannot move. And this helps the griever to stop thought processes that would help them avoid painful thoughts and the dysphoria associated with loss. The third task is to adjust to a world without the deceased. This kind of works on three levels: external adjustments, where the survivor is usually not aware of the roles played by the deceased until sometime after the loss occurs. And we're going to look at this in secondary losses. There are internal adjustments that have to be made, which deal more with managing the fundamentally how death affects self-determination, self-esteem, and a sense of self-efficacy. And then there are spiritual adjustments. Loss can challenge one's fundamental life values and philosophical beliefs that are influenced by our families, peers, education, and religion, as well as life experiences. And then the final task is to find a way to remember the deceased while embarking on the rest of one's journey through life. The counselor's task then becomes not to help the bereaved give up the relationship with the deceased, but to help them find an appropriate place for the dead in their emotional, a place that will enable them to go on living effectively in the world. Not completing this task may result in the survivor living an unfulfilled, stagnant, and sorrowful life. They just don't move, they get stuck. So when people refuse to grieve, a couple of things happen. So as far as mental health, so unresolved grief can be found as a factor in the development of a wide range of psychological problems, including outbursts of rage, restlessness, depression, addiction, compulsion, anxiety, and panic attacks or panic disorders. Unexpressed grief can be linked to the development of worsening medical conditions such as diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, cancer, asthma, and a variety of allergies, rashes, aches, and pains. We are at odds with our body's built-in physiological processes to deal with a traumatic event if we don't grieve. And we are at odds with God's spiritual intentions to meet us in the midst of the fire of our trauma, missing out on his plans to deepen our faith and strengthen our relationship with him. So the first task was acceptance. Let's talk a little bit about acceptance, because people will say, oh, you've got to accept it, you've got to move on. That's true. However, we're going to give another framework for acceptance. So acceptance is not submission. It is the acknowledgement of the facts of the situation, then deciding what you're going to do about it. For instance, a fact is that today is Wednesday. You have to accept that. It's not Thursday, it's not Monday. So it's Wednesday. Acceptance comes from acknowledging the reality. It is the first step toward rebuilding or restructuring your life. You do not have to like the reality, but it is the reality. Acceptance, so simply accepting the fact of death, as well as the pain death brings, liberates one from perpetual grieving. Acceptance is not forgetting. You will never forget your loved one. It is not simple. Accepting a loss is painful. It is not denying your feelings. It is giving yourself grace. It is not quick, it's a process. So patience is required. It is not pretending that you are back to your old self. You have experienced a tremendous disturbance to your world. Your world has been forever changed. Now, let's look at our second goal, which is types of grief. We have normal grief, anticipatory grief, disenfranchised grief, and complicated grief. So all of the expressions that we're going to be talking about today, all of them are a part of normal grief. Because remember, grief is not one emotion, and no one emotion is appropriate for the grieving. Grieving is as individual as you are. It is as individual as your clients are. It is painful, but it's also natural. So with anticipatory grief, this occurs when we are expecting or anticipating a loss that we know will significantly impact our life. The loss has not occurred, but it's inevitable. Because the impact of death is individual and unique, there are many factors in play as one is preparing for the death of a loved one. Warden notes that mourning may begin to be processed during this time. He noted that some may experience increased anxiety. Some may emotionally withdraw or detach too soon because they're trying to prepare for the loved one being gone. Some may have an acute sense of their own personal death. Some may role rehearse. Some may attach. They'll become so close to the loved one because they know that the loss is coming. During this time of anticipatory grief, it is especially difficult for parents of terminally ill children. Second kind of grief is disenfranchised grief. This is grief. So when we think of grief, it's often only associated with death. And that's why we're looking at grief and losses. So disenfranchised grief is grief that is stigmatized or socially unacceptable. Mourning is generally forced to be private, and there is little support for the griever. There are many types of disenfranchised or unrecognized grief. For instance, miscarriage, abortion, divorce, the loss of a job, a loved one who's incarcerated, financial loss, the loss of a pet, loved ones who are addicted to drugs or alcohol, the loss in being a caregiver, the loss that occurs with empty nest, the loss of health, and the loss of a homeland or immigration losses. So with loss that is stigmatized or not clearly or generally recognized, there are often a subgroup of unrecognized grievers. For instance, those who are developmentally delayed. We think that children are so resilient, they're just going to bounce back. Mentally incompetent, the intellectually disabled, and loved ones of those who are killed in the act of a crime. We generally don't think or have empathy with the families of those. Complicated grief, and this is where the professionals kind of hopefully become involved. Complicated grief is just that. It is grief that has become complicated. It is a debilitating, intense grief that interrupts the life of the person experiencing a loss. It interferes with the healing process of the person, and they get stuck in their grief, in their pain. Denials, distractions, avoidance, and acute grief dominates that person's life. The DSM-5 has a framework for diagnosing complicated grief and complicated mourning. Additionally, one of the resources, Warden, he has clues that can help clinicians determine if a person's grief has crossed the line and has become complicated. All right, types of losses, our second point. So this is not an all-inclusive list. Many of your clients will come to you and they may be dealing with the death of a loved one, the death of a child, a miscarriage, a divorce, the loss of a relationship, the loss of a spouse, the loss of their health, the loss of innocence, and immigration losses. A lot of these losses carry secondary losses. For instance, for a spouse, when a person loses their spouse, they may have also lost the person who did all the cooking, or the person who handled all of the bills, or the person who drove them everywhere. And this is where helping in task three, this is where we can help people redefine who they are, and with the external, internal, and religious adjustments, helping them build their self-worth, their self-esteem. So losses, as I mentioned earlier, the death of a child is particularly difficult to help someone manage and to experience, because it involves excruciating pain that alternates between pain and numbness, and it persists. Many parents who've lost their son or a daughter report that they only exist. And every emotion beyond that seems nearly impossible. It has been said that coping with the death and loss of a child requires some of the hardest work one will ever have to do. Along with the usual symptoms and stages of grief, there are many issues that make parental bereavement particularly difficult to resolve. And this grief over the loss of a child can be exacerbated and complicated by feelings of injustice. Why is it my child here? This never should have happened. It should have been me. Why my child? But there are other losses that people experience, that we all experience. The loss of a sibling. Evidence supports that birth order plays a role in your grief. You may have to financially help with raising your nieces or nephews. That impacts you. You may have to help with your in-laws. If you are an only child, you have lost that connection. That's a significant loss. You may have to become a caregiver to aging or sick parents. That's a loss. And the loss of grandparents. You've lost a connection to the past. You've lost maybe the most influential person in your life from a cultural perspective for many who are experiencing immigration loss. And you have and many people have lost the person who encouraged them, supported them, and listened to them. These losses bring great pain. Losses experienced in divorces or relationship is companionship, possibly financial security, a social structure, immediate family, because sometimes when relationships dissolve or when there's a death, a parent moves away and the children and the parent become estranged. You may have lost your extended family, your home, your sense of self-worth, and your sense of stability. Children of divorce have many losses, and studies show that they tend to carry a pattern of insecurity, depression, anxiety, and anger because of the extent of the loss. The family unit, possible permanent loss of a parent, their home, their neighborhood, their school, their friends, a standard of living, family outings, extended family connections. These are losses that impact the lives maybe your life or the life of some of your clients. When we look at another type of losses, it's the loss of innocence. These losses generally are associated with sexual trauma or abuse and neglect. And so for those who have lived through this, there's a loss of a sense of security, a sense of identity, their self-worth and self-esteem, their trust in others, self-confidence, the ability to see the future with hope, and in many cases, a sense of right or wrong. Heritage losses, they've lost loved ones. In many instances, when people move to the United States or to different countries, they've lost their profession and they have to start again. They've lost their traditions that they were surrounded with. They've lost their entire assumptive world. Everything they knew has changed. They've lost their identity, in many cases their homeland, because it's difficult to go back, family values, and they also have to deal with language losses, learning a new language, all of those new skills. Now, this is one that most people suffer or will at one point, the loss of health. That attacks your self-confidence, possibly your financial identity, your home, self-esteem, self-identity, again, the assumptive world, dreams, your dreams for your future, maybe for retirement, future plans, and in many cases, hope, because illness really takes a toll. These losses have to be recognized. Now, when we talk about disenfranchised grief, some of the disenfranchised losses, again, is abortion, losing a loved one to suicide, loss due to a loved one being incarcerated. You don't have that child or that friend or that family member to lean on in a very physical way. So another one is the death of a dream. Many people can get stuck grieving dreams that they had that never came true. I'm sure a lot of us know people who relive their glory days, relive high school experiences, relive college experiences. The death of a pet for many people brings, great pain, because that death has been, that pet has been their companion. Losses due to HIV and AIDS, and losses due to divorce. Some losses that you're gonna experience or that you're gonna come in contact with are people who have lost people to accidents, overdoses, disasters, murders, mass murders, and war. With this, the grief is wrapped around a lot of questioning. If there's a natural disaster where bodies can't necessarily be identified, people may have this question: was it really my husband in the building? Maybe he escaped. Maybe he's wandering around with amnesia. Or did my loved one suffer? Did they feel the pain? Did they know they were dying? Anger, a sense of injustice, a sense of dread follows them. And also in cases where domestic violence may be involved, when someone kills their partner or their spouse, the family of those who did the crime, sometimes they're wondering, their loss is stigmatized because people feel they should be punished. It was their child who did it. Now we're going to look at grief manifestations. And remember, all of these are normal until they become complicated, and we'll talk about that. Physical manifestations. Many of these are going to look a lot like mental illness, and they may be. One of the points of this webinar is to help you consider all of the things that may be going on with a client or within your life. Heartache, insomnia, shortness of breath, dizziness and nausea, tightness in the throat, emptiness or a hollowness in the stomach, a lack of energy, tiredness, fatigue, and oversensitivity to noise, muscle weakness, dry mouth, tightness in the chest, back pain, having dreams or nightmares, constant sighing, or eating too much or eating too little. All of these are physical manifestations of grief. It shows up this way. If you have a client with these, it might be great to also recommend a complete physical to rule out any physical, real health conditions. But these are the manifestations that grief brings into our lives. Emotional and psychological manifestations. Fear is a big one. Anger and anxiety, because remember, the assumptive world has changed. They've lost their assumptive world. Absent-mindedness. Many people who are grieving will have a lot of confusion, or they'll be preoccupied with the death, or something minor. They will be hopeless and have despair. Of course, the crying and the sadness. There's a numbness that many grievers feel. Hyperactivity or restlessness, depression, a loss of interest, of course, shock, a lack of self-care, poor hygiene, thoughts of self-harm or suicide. They may also see the deceased, or they may hear the deceased voices or voice. Social expressions, isolation, social withdrawal, alienation, poor communication, excessive texting, excessive social media use, excessive shopping, acting out of character, visiting places that are reminders of the deceased, carrying around objects that belonged to the deceased, loneliness, drinking or an uptake in drinking, substance abuse, substance use. All of these expressions come with grief. And I wanted to particularly note spiritual manifestations. And we're going to talk about culture considerations in a few minutes. For many cultures, religion is a vital part of their life. God built the grief response into us for the purpose of mentally, emotionally, and spiritually processing loss-producing events, integrating those events into our altered world, and helping us move to a state of greater strength, resourcefulness, resilience, and faith. If we are not willing to face the grieving process, or if we try to shortcut it, we're left adrift in a sea of pain, never reaching the shores that the Lord intends for us. So when you may have clients, or you yourself may experience a lack of faith or a loss of faith, anger toward God, anger toward life, or anger toward others, shame, guilt, withdrawal from God and his people, anger towards the deceased, resentment and bitterness. There is great stigma, not only surrounding grief in general, but particularly in the region of faith, because people will say, well, where's your faith in God? You've got to pray. You've got to do this. Those things may be true. However, that's not the answer all the time. So being aware of the spiritual manifestations of grief are very important. A couple of notes on children and how they grieve. Children use fantasy. They use hypochondrias, these ailments and pains that are more in their mind. They project, they blame others, they take out the feelings on someone or something else other than the original source or the deceased person. They displace and they regress. They also use repression, where they unconsciously block out these strong feelings, or suppression, where they hold back on the strong feelings. Sublimation, so they'll substitute one set of feelings for a more socially acceptable set of feelings. They also may experience a sense of presence, thinking that the deceased is still around them. Or is still in the current area of time and space, especially shortly after the death. And again, they regress. A note about dealing with children who are grieving, who you think may be grieving, or your own children who may be grieving. Be careful in the language that's used about death. Be clear. Don't use phrases like, oh, they went to sleep, or they passed, or they went on a trip, or they went away. Use clear phrases. I understand communicating with children is difficult, but they need communication. You may not have an expansive line of communication with your children, so develop one. Children need empathy. A child's connection is unique. It may not make sense to you, but it makes sense to them. And children may hold back their feelings because they are afraid of hurting you. They may be afraid of hurting their parents. So make sure that as adults, we learn to manage our grief so children can learn to manage their grief and don't carry our grief for us. Youth losses, those who are a little older. Some of the losses that young people experience is a loss due to adults' addiction. Many children are involved in foster care or kinship care, and that's a great loss for them. They may have never met their parents. I have quite a few adopted children. And so losses due to addiction, losses due to the change in a family structure, an older sibling moving away to college or moving into their own home, or a new sibling. A baby can bring about a lot of mixed feelings for that older sibling, or combining families, a step family. There are losses associated with that. Death, of course, divorce, their friends may move away, or they may have to move away. My husband served in the military for almost 30 years, and children of military personnel experience great loss, because think about it, very often they're moving anywhere between 2 to 4 years. A parent is gone for extended periods of time. So that brings about great loss. Remember that sense of security, that sense of identity, those things impact the child. And so some of the manifestations may be, well, let me go back. When children are diagnosed with health issues, for instance, diabetes, their life has changed. Food, the fun things that they used to could do, maybe they can't do now. That's a great loss. Weight issues may impact them. Kids who have things like severe acne, the way they beat up on themselves because of what they perceive people think of them, that's a great loss, because we think of youth as being the happiest time of our lives. Plans, hopes, and dreams, those are things that children lose. Their sense of security, their sense of innocence. Many young people have experienced friends who are committing suicide. It's interesting that young children who have like a prized stuffed animal, if that animal is lost, they have a loss because that animal for some reason has brought them a lot of security. It's been there for them, their best friend. Children who move away to college have losses too. And so some of the manifestations of those are fear. They don't want to be separated. Again, they regress. And this is also for older children. There's guilt, because children have a way of finding the wrong answer. And that's one reason we need to communicate with them, because they may think, he died because I wanted him dead, or because I did something wrong, or I didn't love him enough. So there may be confusion. There may be a lot of confusion being manifested, and they may socially withdraw. Now, teens are a whole different beast, quite naturally. So there's a theory there's a teen grief cycle: shock, disorganization, and reorganization. Shock makes sense because there's a numbness that can be misleading because you think that the teen is not grieving. It is often characterized by a disbelief and a searching behavior. And shock can last for days or even longer, depending on the circumstances, which leads to disorganization, and this is the longest phase for teens. It's recurring. It involves general lethargy, sleep disturbances, they can't sleep or they're sleeping too much, appetite changes, a lack of concentration, which may impact academics and driving for those who are a little older. Because during disorganization, they're feeling the full impact of the loss. They have feelings of yearning, of sadness, of missing, heavy-heartedness. Fear creeps in, and they may be fearing the life without the person if they're deceased or have moved away, or maybe there's a divorce. Again, we see anger. Teens increase or may increase risky behaviors. The intensity and duration diminishes as time moves on, and relief can be felt, and that will hopefully or should lead to reorganization, where the fog of disorganization is lifted. Many teens are able to decide with proper help, proper support, decide that they will experience the loss and grieving and use it as an impetus for their own personal growth. College students and young adults, many of us have them, with them when they are grieving, whatever they may be grieving. There's great stress on their mind and body. You may see them overscheduling or hear them just having a constant busy schedule, depression, sleep disturbances, overusing social media. So when we look at all of the expressions of grief, they're multi and multifaceted. Just things for us to be aware of as we're helping people. Now, effective interventions for grief. So two considerations I want us to consider as we move in this so that we can be professionally competent. And one is gender insights, because gender insights and cultural insights must be respected, acknowledged, and informed. We will briefly discuss the significance of becoming competent to serve clients as we seek to help the brokenhearted and do no harm. In all of these are generalizations, not specifics, or not absolutes. Women in their grief process, they talk more easily. They tell and retell the story so that they can make sense of it. That's a way of processing the grief. They are generally led by their emotions. They feel their way through grief. Their language is intuitive, earthy, and fluid, or it may be elusive, but they are talking more. They focus on connections, and they seek companionship to support feelings and meet intimacy needs. Men tend to be more stoic and appear as if they are not feeling anything. And one of the reasons is because they don't talk a lot, because it's like the story is etched in their mind. They don't need to keep talking about it because it's right there, hitting them every time. Intellect is their guide. They think their way through grief. Their language is orderly, concise, controlled, and goal-oriented. Generally, men are taught to be less expressive, less self-disclosing, less interdependent. And they often grieve on the inside. So they may spend a lot of time by themselves, which can be really difficult if they are in relationships or if there are children involved. Cultural considerations. Please be aware that all cultures do not treat death and grief in the same manner. As the world becomes more global, it is important to recognize that you will meet and help many people from different places, regions, and nations. Do not assume that they grieve as you do. Also, do not give meaning to their grief. Let them do that. Help them do that. There are vast differences within cultures and ethnicities. No culture is monolithic, so get to know your client. And then, if necessary, do a little research on your own about who they are, where they're from, what they believe. Cultural demographics include nationality, race, gender, socioeconomic status, and religion. No knowledge about grief is culture free. Culture creates, influences, shapes, and limits our understanding and experiences of grief. Understanding the complex entanglement of culture and grieving can help us provide better support to a culturally diverse grieving people. Some of the techniques that can be used to help people that you can fold into your practice and processes is to help your client actualize their loss. Give them voice to talk, let them talk, and help the client identify and experience feelings. Generally we're taught 3 major feelings: happy, mad, or sad. There are so many more feelings. Included in the package is a list of emotions and a schedule that you can give to clients that I have found very useful, not only in grief, but in other areas, maybe anxiety, where you give them this list and they're supposed to write down at certain times, choose an emotion or write an emotion that they're feeling, because what that can help them do is clear the fog of what they're actually feeling. Because, some of us, if we have a bad day, even though 90% of the day was good and 10% was bad, we just say we had a bad day. So it's helping people identify and experience their feelings. Reality testing helps with that. Cognitive restructuring helps with that, especially with guilt and anxiety and helplessness. You can help assist living without the deceased. Help the client learn decision-making skills and how to address possibly secondary losses. If the spouse can't drive, encourage them to get their license. Help them with their self-worth, which is number 4. Help the client find meaning in loss. Help with rebuilding self-esteem, self-worth as it relates to the locus of control. Helping them understand they can learn the skills and encouraging them to learn the skills to where they can put the deceased in an appropriate place so that they can continue to live. Help the client to remember the deceased or the loss and emotionally relocate the deceased so that they can move forward. Number 6 I have on here is provide time to grieve. Recognize that there will be difficult times and periods like holidays, anniversaries, and do your best to help the client to prepare. Again, in the list of references, the underlined persons or books have great resources to help you with that if you feel that's something that your client needs. Another intervention that's really important is to interpret normal behavior. Hopefully with some of the things that we've discussed, you've seen that normal behavior is what a person is feeling, unless you find or they find that they're stuck. And they can even include hallucinations, heightened distractibility, and again, preoccupation. I also refer you again to the DSM-5 for further clarification. Allow for individual differences. Examine their defenses and coping skills. If you find that they are being avoidant in their emotional coping, help them to develop healthier skills. And finally, identify pathology and refer. If it is above your competence, refer them as you would normally. Or if you're suffering from some of these symptoms and you need help, find a support group or reach out to a local organization. They can help you find support. Worden also recommends that you can use evocative language, the use of symbols, writing, drawing, role playing, supporting your client to role play, cognitive restructuring, memory books, and directed imagery. It is imperative that you are developing or have developed a rapport with your client, or these individual interventions will be totally ineffective. Be intentional, be informed. Again, for more detailed instruction, please refer to Warden's work. Hoban also has so many assessments that you can just kind of slide into your work to see if grief is something that your client may possibly be dealing with. Now, coping skills, we're going to begin with youth. Try to get them to journal, or again, to use that list to help them identify their feelings. Encourage them to reach out to family and friends. Help them make realistic promises and keep them. Tap into their creativity. Encourage them to volunteer, or just to simply take a walk outside. Encourage them to eat properly, exercise, try something new, or even create a sacred space where they can go and kind of just feel what they're feeling. Prayer is really important. People say, well, I don't know how to pray. Well, God knows how to listen. Encourage them to do fun things, because one of the things we want them to see in their grief is it's okay to be happy. It's okay to have fun. This helps them build a different relationship with their loss or with the deceased. Listen to music. Music really does soothe the savage beast. It helps lift the mood. It takes you to a different place. And a lot of young people love music. Old people do too, but music is a really good thing. Encourage them to join a support group. For college students, those who may be away as parents, encourage them to find meaningful ways to commemorate the loss. Encourage them to connect with their family, because their family is grieving the loss too, maybe differently. Engage in community service projects. This can help them. Encourage them not to overschedule, to take time away, to process, to just have downtime. Consider their religion and their faith, because it can be a great source of comfort to them. And strongly help them and guide them to resist escapism, to resist drugs, to resist alcohol, to resist promiscuity, because those things only bring a whole different set of problems. They may need help. And so counseling is always a great option. Parent who comes in, because very often, I'm sure that many of you have found that when people come in, they present with one thing, but there are other things going on. So with parents, I've had clients who they'll say, well, a couple of weeks into working with them, they'll be like, and yeah, I lost my mom and my dad within 2 months of each other. And then, my dog died. I had that dog for 15 years. And then I lost my job. And then my husband is sick. Oh, that's a lot. So encourage them to take small steps, to remember the positive, to let others know their need. Again, to reach out to loved ones. If they don't have loved ones, join a support group. And then a lot of times with parents, and back to that anticipatory grief, parents who've lost children at a young age, encourage them not to hide from their guilt. It's probably unfounded, because most parents do the best that they can, but they carry guilt. And so encouraging them not to run from it, but to understand that guilt has a purpose and that you can move through it. Coping skills in general to help yourself or to help your client. Praying. God is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. Understand that the religious manifestations or the spiritual manifestations, a broken relationship with God. You may be angry with God, but guess what? God is big enough to handle that. And so additionally, when you have clients from diverse communities, remember their culture may have religion or faith or spirituality as a great resource for them. encourage them to tap into it, because you can always explain to them that God understands your grief. He lost his only son. And if you look at that account in Matthew chapter 27, you see some of the manifestations that we have. You see the darkness that came. Well, with loss and grief, darkness is generally a part of it. That's why you have that confusion. You know, that's why you have that preoccupation, that absent-mindedness. The assumptive world changing, the earthquakes happen. So everything that was known doesn't make sense anymore. So encourage them to pray and to reach out to their faith communities. Now, big ones, encouraging patience and or other big ones, encouraging patience and kindness to themselves or to yourself. You cannot heal what you do not feel. It just don't work. Tell the story. Talking about it over and over again is a way of processing grief. Yes, I understand. You may feel the person is tired of hearing it, but you need to tell the story until you get tired of telling it. And then that helps put you on a pathway of acceptance. Journaling helps tremendously, because what that does, that gives our feelings another place to go. We can put them on paper so they go somewhere else. Establishing rituals, music again, restructuring your assumptive world, which is one of those tasks that you have to do. Preparing for stressful events, practicing self-care. And for those providers, remember that you don't want to get caught up, and it's easy to get caught up in vicarious trauma. So you have to practice self-care. Remember, it is okay to laugh. Tell them it is okay to laugh. Let others know what kind of help they need. And that is pretty much it. I want to refer you to the references pages. You'll see where I have some of these things underlined. Again, they are great resources, have great assessments, and great knowledge. And the same way with the additional resources. I want you guys to notice that right here locally, we have the support care and the spiritual support and care ministries. You have the Mental Health Association right here. For those who may want more work in dealing with children, on November 17th, it is Children's Grief Awareness Day. There are a lot of things that are going to be online at that website. Tear Soup, I don't know if many of you have heard of that. That is a great video, a DVD, to show people who are in the process of grieving. And Hamilton's Funeral Home, they have great free resources for almost every kind of grief that a person may be experiencing, almost every kind of loss. And with that concludes my presentation.